Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Yeah.
80 years ago, Victory in Europe Day. A huge moment.
Absolutely monumental. And it's fascinating to see how we view it now.
Right. And YouGov has just done this really interesting survey across Europe, the U.S.
Yeah, looking at attitudes to World War II, but also, future worries.
Exactly. It gives us this unique snapshot, doesn't it? How this massive event from generations ago still echoes.
It really does. Shapes how we think about, well, everything. Nations, relationships, potential crises.
So that's our plan today. We're going to dig into these YouGov findings.
Yep. Pull out the key stuff, what's important, maybe what's surprising.
For anyone wanting to grasp current thinking on this. Okay, so first step.
Yeah.
Knowledge. How much could people feel they know about World War II? What did that show?
Well, there were some pretty noticeable differences. France and Germany came out highest.
Yeah.
Around 72%, 70% saying they knew a great deal or a fair amount.
And elsewhere.
Britain and the U.S. were a bit lower, sort of two-thirds territory. But Spain was way down at 40%.
40%. And Spain was neutral, of course.
Exactly. It kind of suggests that direct involvement, or lack thereof, plays a role in that collective memory, maybe.
Makes sense. Did this survey connect this to schooling? Like, how much people were taught about it?
It did, yeah. And there's the link. France, again, highest perceived knowledge, also had the most people, 77%, saying they were taught a lot about the war.
Right.
Germany next, about 60%. And Spain, again, lower end, only 34%.
So education seems pretty key to how much people think they know.
It looks that way. And interestingly, younger people were actually more likely to say they'd been taught about it.
Oh, really? So it's still a big focus in schools.
Seems like it, which fits with another finding.
What's that?
Well, despite those knowledge differences, there's massive agreement on continuing to teach it. Huge majorities, like 82 to 90% across all the countries, said yes, it's still important to teach World War II history.
Wow, that's almost universal consensus.
Pretty much. And most people, 72 to 87%, also think the war and the events leading up to it are still relevant today.
So the feeling is, we know varying amounts, but we all agree it matters, and its lessons are still alive.
That's the takeaway, yeah. It's seen as vital for understanding now and, well, the future.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. The survey tackled something, well, quite heavy. The idea of history repeating itself. Specifically, Nazi-like crimes.
Yes, this was quite sobering. They asked if people thought crimes like those committed by the Nazi regime could happen in their own country in their lifetime.
And the answers?
Worryingly high, really. Between 31% and 52% across the different nations said yes, they thought it could.
Even in Germany?
Even in Germany. They were at 44%, kind of in the middle, but still nearly half think it's conceivable.
That's quite a statistic. It really points to some underlying anxiety, doesn't it?
It certainly seems to. What fuels that, across such different places? That's the big question.
Did they ask about it happening elsewhere, like other European countries or the U.S.?
They did. And interestingly, the perceived risk for another Western European country was slightly higher, 44% to 59%.
Higher than for their own country?
In some cases, yes. And then they asked about the USA. Again, pretty high numbers. Between 44% and 60% thought Nazi-style crimes could happen there. That includes Americans themselves. 52% of Americans thought it could happen in the U.S.
Wow. Like that Sinclair Lewis book, It Can't Happen Here.
Yeah.
Except people do seem to think it could.
Precisely. A real concern about maybe the fragility of democracy.
The British survey apparently went deeper into specific scenarios.
That's right. They asked about a fascist dictatorship taking power, invading neighbors, interning groups, even exterminating them.
Heavy stuff.
Very. About 42% of Britons felt a fascist dictatorship seizing power was possible in Britain. That lines up with the general Nazi-like crimes number.
The less likely for the other things. Invasion, internment.
Yes, they saw those specific actions as less likely in Britain. Here's the twist.
Go on.
They were much more likely to think those things could happen in other Western European countries, and especially in the USA.
Really? More likely in the U.S.
Significantly so. Like 66% of Britons thought a fascist regime could take over the U.S.
That is striking. A real difference in where the perceived threat lies.
It is. Lots to unpack there about national perceptions, maybe media influence, who knows?
Definitely. Okay, let's move to historical narratives. Who gets the credit for defeating the Nazis? Because that view has changed, hasn't it?
Oh, dramatically. It's a perfect example of how collective memory evolves. Think back to 1945 in France.
Right, there was that poll then.
Exactly. And back then, the French overwhelmingly said the Soviet Union played the biggest part.
But now, this YouGov survey shows.
A complete flip. Now, across most of Europe and in America, too, the USA gets the most credit, usually around 40% to 52%.
It's a massive shift. Why do you think that is? Cold War, American culture?
Probably a mix of all that. Decades of Cold War narratives, U.S. global dominance, Hollywood movies, it all shapes perception.
But not everywhere thinks the U.S. was number one.
No. Britain is the outlier. In the UK, the most common answer, 41%, is that the UK played the greatest role in the victory.
Okay, so Brits credit themselves most. How's the UK seen elsewhere?
Much less so. Only a tiny minority in the other countries put the UK first.
And the USSR's contribution? How's that viewed now?
That perception has really faded across the board. Now only gets credited by about 17% to 28%.
It really shows how national perspectives shape history, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And how that narrative can be, well, rewritten over time.
This survey also went into some morally tricky areas of the war. Allied bombing campaigns, for instance.
Yes, against Germany and Japan. Starting with Germany, the strategic bombing, opinions are split.
How so?
Well, in Britain and the USA, majorities tend to see it as morally justified. But in Germany, a majority says it was not justified.
Understandable, given the devastation.
Completely. It highlights that tension between, military aims and ethical lines in war.
And what about the atomic bombs? Hiroshima, Nagasaki, even more controversial, I'd imagine.
Definitely. Views were even more divided and generally more critical. Fewer people across all countries saw the atomic bombings as justified compared to the bombing of Germany.
How did Americans feel?
They were quite split themselves. Britons were much less likely to justify the A-bombs than the German bombings. And in Germany,
Pretty low, I guess.
Extremely low. Just 6% thought they were justifiable. It just shows the unique horror and the ethical weight of nuclear weapons.
Shifting to after the war, how do people view the former Axis powers now? Germany, Italy, their accountability, their rehabilitation.
Right. So people in Britain and the U.S. overwhelmingly feel their own countries were right to fight.
Makes sense.
But in Germany and Italy, very few feel their own country's participation was right. Quite the opposite.
So a sense of wrongdoing.
Yes. Large majorities in Germany and Italy believe their countries were wrong to take part. And quite a few, significant numbers, still feel ashamed about their nation's role.
That's a heavy burden of history. How well do people think they've dealt with that past?
It's interesting. Americans and Britons seem more positive about Germany's efforts to deal with its past than, say, the French or Italians are.
And Italy.
Views on Italy's handling of its past seem more mixed, more divided across the board.
Was Japan included in this?
Yes. And perhaps surprisingly, people in the surveyed countries were actually more likely to think Japan has done a good job dealing with its wartime past than Italy has.
That is surprising, given ongoing historical disputes in Asia.
It is. It's a complex picture. Maybe reflects different levels of public awareness or focus in the West.
Possibly.
Yeah.
Did the survey touch on whether Germany might be too focused on its Nazi past? I know that's debated within Germany.
It did, and Germans themselves are split. Almost half think Germany has been overly conscious of the Nazi era and that maybe this holds it back sometimes in foreign policy.
How do others see that?
Views elsewhere were more varied, less clear-cut. It highlights that difficult balancing act for a nation reconciling with such a dark history.
Okay, one last major area. Keeping the peace after the war. What role do people see for international bodies like the UN, NATO, the EU?
There's definitely recognition for them. The UN gets credited by quite a few people for contributing to peace.
Right.
But NATO seems to come out on top as the organization most seen as having actually prevented another major war in Europe. Majorities in every country surveyed gave it credit.
And the EU.
Also seen widely as a major force for peace on the continent since World War II.
So a strong belief in the value of these post-war institutions for maintaining stability.
Yes, definitely. They're seen as having played and maybe still playing a crucial role.
So wrapping this all up, this YouGov deep dive paints a really complex picture, doesn't it?
Absolutely. You've got these variations in knowledge, but this underlying agreement, it's still relevant.
You got this persistent anxiety about history repeating, about those kinds of atrocities.
Right, and the shifting sands of who gets credit for the victory.
Plus these really difficult differing views on the morality of wartime actions and how nations have reckoned with their past.
And finally, this sense that international cooperation through bodies like NATO and the EU has been key to the peace we've had.
It really underlines how World War II isn't just history. It's still shaping our present anxieties, our international relations, everything.
It really is. Which brings us to a final thought, maybe for you listening.
Yes.
Considering all these different perspectives, these concerns, these shifting views, what do you think? What are the most crucial lessons from World War II that we absolutely need to keep hold of to guide us now and, well, into the future?
That's the big question, isn't it? Something to really mull over. For any further questions, or if you want to explore this more, please do like, subscribe, and comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And remember, the source for this deep dive was YouGov.